This story happened last year when I was 22 years old. I needed a new car because the transmission in mine finally kicked the bucket. It would have been $4,500 to fix a transmission on a car that wasn't even worth $2,000, so obviously that made no sense to do. Anyway, I decided to browse Craigslist to see what I could find. I wasn't in the market for anything too nice because I only had $3,000 saved up for my crappy cashier job. I managed to find a 2006 Chevy Impala. That was perfect. Nothing too fancy, just something to get me between work and home. I reached out to the seller, letting him know that I was interested in the car. To my surprise, he called me back in less than a minute, asking me if I would like to come see the car that day. I was a little taken aback by this, especially considering I had emailed him and he called me back on the phone, but I said sure, that would be great. I asked him a few questions about the car, like what kind of shape it was in and if it had any problems he knew about. He was pretty nice the whole time and told me that the car was in great condition for its age. It was all a pretty normal conversation until out of the blue he asked my name and where I lived. I told him my name was Tom and I gave him the general area of where I live, not my actual street address. He laughed and told me his name was Jeff and that he lived not too far from me. He said that he couldn't wait to have me come by, then he told me his address before ending the call. It was a little creepy how eager this guy seemed to have me come over and look at the car, but I just figured it was because he must need the money as much as I needed a car. I looked up the guy's address, and it said he was only 25 minutes away from my place. I called my friend John and asked if he could give me a ride over there. He said sure thing, and then came to pick me up. When we got to Jeff's neighborhood, I could immediately tell it was pretty sketchy. There were a lot of abandoned houses, some with boarded up windows and graffiti on them. Some of the windows had bars on them too. I was getting a little nervous, but hoped that the seller's house wouldn't be as bad as these other ones. Unfortunately, when we got to Jeff's house though, I could immediately see that his house was worse than the others on the street. Most of the windows were shattered. There was furniture in the lawn, along with cars missing their tires. The entire place gave off a really bad vibe. I looked over at John, and he looked back at me with an expression that said, "Are you sure about this?" This was definitely a creepy situation, but I needed a car, and I could see the Chevy from the ad sitting there in the front yard. We both got out and approached the front door. I knocked, but there was no answer at first. I knocked again, this time even harder. I was just starting to get a bad feeling about the whole thing when a man's voice came from behind the door. "Come on in. The door's open," it said. Just as I put my hand on the doorknob, John grabbed my shoulder and said, "We need to get out of here, now." I asked him why, but he didn't answer. Instead, he just said, "Let's go," in a harsh tone. I could tell that he was serious, so I turned around and we quickly got back into John's car before he backed out of the driveway at a breakneck pace. When we were down the street, I asked him what that was all about. He said that while we were standing at the door, he could see two men through a gap in the window curtains. Each one was wearing a ski mask, and one of them was holding what looked to be a gun in his hand. It dawned on me that the seller was likely just luring me in to rob me, or worse. I looked down at my phone and saw a notification from Craigslist. It was Jeff, the seller. "Where did you go?" it said. I chose to ignore it, and when I got back home, I deleted my Craigslist account. I don't know for certain what that man's intentions were, but I do know they must not have been anything good. I feel lucky that my friend was there with me and noticed what was happening inside. I still don't have a car, but I'm happy to ride the bus until I find one that isn't on Craigslist. This story happened when I was 19 years old. I needed a new roommate quickly and decided to go on Craigslist and post an ad saying I was looking for someone to split the rent with me in exchange for living in the house I was in. I was a broke college kid, and the only way I was able to live in the off-campus house I was in was due to having a roommate. But since Kyle bailed, I was on my own with no way to pay the rent. I had a few people reach out, but none of them seemed too serious about it. Eventually, I was starting to give up, until I got a message one day from a girl named Ashley. She said she was looking for a new place to stay and would be happy to come check out the house if the other room was still available. I messaged her back that it was still available, and she could come over the next day to come take a look around and see what she thought. It felt a little awkward at first because I'm a guy and I've never had a female roommate, but I needed the help to pay the rent, and if it didn't bother her, then I decided there was no reason to feel awkward. After she came over and looked around for a bit, she said she loved the house and would definitely like to move in if that was okay. I told her that would be great, and she moved her stuff the following weekend. The first week of her living there was really pleasant. She hardly made any noise, and she would always clean up after herself. I felt like I had gotten really lucky to have Ashley as a roommate, and everything was all good. That is, until I came home from my economics class one evening. I had walked into my bedroom to find some of my things missing, like a comb I had left on my desk, and also some of my shirts. I thought that was a little odd, but maybe I had misplaced them. I asked Ashley if she had happened to see my stuff anywhere, and she said she hadn't. That was weird, but I decided that I must have just misplaced those things, and they would turn up soon enough. I did some homework for a few hours before turning off the light and going to sleep. I was woken up a few hours later by the sound of talking coming from Ashley's room. I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door, standing in the narrow hallway. There was no more talking, but I could have sworn I heard another person's voice coming from her room. I went back to bed, trying to forget about what had just happened. The next few weeks, more of my things started going missing. Nothing too expensive like my TV or my Xbox, but just small things like some of my clothes, an old pair of boots, some food. Every time I would ask Ashley if she knew anything about it, she would say she had no idea. I had no reason not to believe her. What would she want with some of my clothes and old boots anyway? I was laying in bed late one night, studying for a math exam, when I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. I looked at the clock and saw that it was close to midnight. I would have assumed it was just Ashley, but she was out at a frat party that night, and I hadn't heard her come inside. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and slowly crept out of my bedroom and down towards the kitchen. I poked my head around the corner to see a man rummaging through the fridge. I could feel the adrenaline dump into my body as I prepared for fight or flight. I saw that the front door was still locked, so how did he get in? I was sure I didn't hear anyone come in or out. I lifted the bat above my head and stepped into the kitchen, shouting at the man to get the hell out of my house now and that the cops were already on their way. The man jumped backwards, clearly surprised. He put his hands up in front of himself in a defensive gesture, and I noticed something weird. The intruder standing in my kitchen was wearing my shirt, my pants, and my shoes. Just as I was starting to take this all in, the front door opened. Ashley stood in the doorway, her eyes wide as she looked at the bat I was holding, and then at the man leaning against the counter, begging for his life. I shouted at Ashley to get out, it wasn't safe, and to call the cops. She just stood there though, not in fear, but with a defeated expression on her face. She told me that the man in the kitchen wasn't an intruder, but that he was her boyfriend, Kyle, and he had been secretly living in her bedroom with her the whole time. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Apparently they saw my ad on Craigslist and couldn't pass up on the price, because they couldn't afford anywhere else. So they decided that it would be easier for just one of them to get accepted, because if they both came, it would be more expensive for them. As for my clothes, the boyfriend, Kyle, had been coming out of the bedroom and taking them when I wasn't home. I was completely shocked and didn't know what to say. Eventually, I told Ashley that I wasn't going to call the cops, but they needed to find a new place to live. I felt bad that they couldn't afford a place to stay as a couple, but this definitely was not the way to go about solving that problem. They were out the next day, and all of my clothes and items were left in the now empty bedroom. I've since found a new roommate and will not be using Craigslist anytime soon. This story happened to me just last month. I had just bought a new laptop and decided I would recycle my old one, since I no longer had any use for it. My dad suggested that I should sell it, though, and make a little money. He said I should try selling it on Craigslist. I had never used Craigslist before, but decided to give it a shot. I got online and set up my account. Then I posted a picture of my laptop and wrote a little bit about it underneath, just saying that it's in good working order and I'm only selling it because I bought a newer laptop. I put the price down as $150 and included my phone number so that any interested buyers could call or text me. I hadn't heard anything until a few days later, when a guy named Mike sent me a message asking if the laptop was still available. I told him it was, and he said that he would be interested in buying it. The guy then asked if it was okay if he came by later tonight after he got done with work to come pick up the laptop. I said that was fine, and then sent him my address. After dinner that night, I waited outside on my front porch for the guy Mike to show up. I was just beginning to think that the guy wasn't going to come when I got a phone call from him saying that he didn't think he was going to be able to pick up the laptop because his car was making a strange noise. We agreed to meet at the parking lot of a nearby grocery store instead, because that's where he said he had pulled in. I grabbed the laptop and got in my car, and headed off to the grocery store where Mike was waiting. It was only about a 10-minute drive from where I lived. When I pulled into the store parking lot, I could see a guy parked towards the edge of the lot, leaning against his white Ford pickup. I pulled up next to the guy and rolled my window down. He asked if I was the guy from Craigslist, and I said I was, and that I had the laptop in the back seat. Instead of paying for the laptop and going on his way, he asked if it would be possible for me to follow him back to his house and do the deal there. He said he just moved out to the area and didn't know anyone, and so if he broke down on the side of the road, he didn't know what he'd do, and that he only lived a few minutes away. I felt a little unsure about the whole thing, but I agreed. I really needed the money, and if he only lived a few minutes away, what could be the harm? He got in his car, and I followed him for the next few minutes on a busy highway. We then got onto a back road that was surrounded by trees on both sides. While I was driving, my phone vibrated with a new message from Mike. He said that his house was coming up on the left, and we were almost there. When we got to his house, it looked like no one had lived there for years. There were no lights on inside, no curtains, the lawn was overgrown, and some of the siding was falling off. I parked my car behind his and grabbed the laptop from my back seat. As soon as I got out of the car, I looked up and saw 4 other men standing beside Mike, all of them pointing a gun in my direction. Mike told me to hand over the laptop and empty out my pockets. I did what I was told. I didn't have very much money in my pockets, but what I had, I handed it all over to Mike, including my phone. After this, all of the men got back into the car and drove away. I was left dumbstruck, but eventually I drove back home, went to my neighbor's house, and used their phone to call the police. When the cops came, I gave them a description of Mike and of the white pickup he was driving. They said that they would likely be able to track my phone and be able to find him that way. It's been over a month now, and I haven't heard anything, and to my knowledge, the guy who robbed me has never been found. I haven't used Craigslist since that incident, and I don't plan to, ever again.